Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the History of Diving Museum. My name is Lisa Mangili. I'm the executive director, and we're here tonight to present our February Immerse Yourself with Kamau Sadiki. We practiced this. I'm so sorry. Sadiki. I'm sorry. You're going to have to correct me. I'm sorry. We practiced this
You got it right.
earlier. He'll be our speaker tonight. We're very honored to have him. He's been a great supporter of the History of Diving Museum, was very instrumental when we put together the Restoring Our Oceans, Preserving Our Heritage exhibit with Diving with a Purpose. He worked with us with Samuel L. Jackson on the Enslaved documentary, as well as the Clotilda documentary, and we're very happy to have him. So we'll be turning it over to him in a minute. We'd also like to thank our sponsors who made this evening available and free, open to the public. The Culture Builds Florida and the Draves family, who have been longtime members of the History of Diving Museum. So thank you. If you haven't been to the History of Diving Museum, we're located at mile marker 83 in Isla Mirada in the Florida Keys. We're open daily from 10 to 5. So we say, don't drive by, dive in. You can also check us out online at divingmuseum.org and follow us on social media at Diving Museum. So with all of that, it is my pleasure to introduce Kamau Sadiki and learn about the submerged cultural resources, the slave ships, the important history of those lost stories, and bringing them back to us. So thank you for your work, and thank you for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Kamau Sadiki. I'm a lead instructor and board member with an organization called Diving with a Purpose. And Lisa, I just wanted to say publicly, I appreciate all the support and that you've given Diving with a Purpose over the years. It's been really incredible. That exhibit in 2019 was just awesome. So it really gave us a lot of good visibility. So appreciate that. So I also want to thank everyone for attending this afternoon or this evening. I really appreciate that. Hopefully we can have some insightful discussions and thoughts as we talk this evening. But as we talk about this topic of slave ships, any discussion of slave ships, there's sort of a connectivity, intersectionality, if you will, with archaeology, history, cultural heritage, and for me, more importantly, remembrance. So I think we're going to be touching upon each one of those topics tonight. But for right now, what's touching me most is remembrance. There was some 2 million plus Africans that were on slave ships and coming across what we call the Middle Passage. So those 2 million plus souls were somehow, for whatever reason, thrown overboard. And so they are now, their bones are at the bottom of the sea, maybe encrusted in coral, God forbid, crunched by the teeth of sharks. But their voices are silenced and they're unknown. And these were human beings, people. These were mothers, fathers. They were someone's sister, brother, loved ones. There were children as well. So before I start my presentation, I think it's very appropriate that if you like, I will, if you can join me and just pause just for a few seconds in remembrance of those 2 million silent souls. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so with that said, just a small disclaimer. Anytime you talk about the history of slavery and the slave trade, in this case, slave ships, there could be a possibility that some of this might be a bit traumatic to you. And if it is, I suggest you either turn your audio down or look away. I don't have any really difficult material in the presentation, but just all of our tastes are different. So I'm just throwing out that little disclaimer. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So the title of this presentation is Search for Sunken Slave Ships. I'm going to get this out of the way so we can possibly see the slides. And as I said, when we're talking about slave ships, this intersectionality with anthropology and history and cultural heritage and remembrance all sort of intersect, and that's sort of going to weave throughout my presentation this evening. So I'm going to start the discussion with these topics. Excuse me. Hopefully my voice hold up here, so I might be taking a few drinks of water as we go along here. So these are the topics basically I'm going to touch upon. A little bit about diving with a purpose and who we are, and particularly the slave ship, its meaning, and even the slave ship as a metaphor. Excuse me. Of course, the transatlantic, what we like to reference as the transoceanic slave trade. We know the Atlantic is between Africa and the Americas, but there were other movements of human bodies, black bodies particularly, during the trade. And so we'll talk a bit about that. And also talk a little about the known slave shipwrecks. As I mentioned earlier, excuse me, please pardon me if I have to clear my throat real frequently here. Don't know what's going on. But anyway, known slave shipwrecks, we'll talk a little bit about that. And also restoring memory, why we need to bring this phase of global history back into our memories. And we're going to highlight a few of these slave vessels and the role that they played in the trade. Okay, so let's sort of get started in earnest here. Diving with a purpose. Again, as I mentioned, my name is Kamau Sadiki, and I'm a board member and lead instructor with Diving with a Purpose. What do we do? Well, first, what we are not. We are not maritime archaeologists. We consider ourselves maritime archaeology advocates. And the organization itself, we've been going for about 18 years, founded by an incredible gentleman named Ken Stewart and Brenda Lazendorf with the National Park Service. Bless her heart. She transitioned back in 2008, I believe. But that's what got us started. And so what we do is we trained certified divers how to provide critical support to, say, a maritime archaeologist or principal investigator, if you will, and trying to discover the stories, tell the stories in a very scientific way of these shipwrecks, not necessarily more than just slave shipwrecks. We worked on a number of missions here. So through that process, we provide a course, an immersion course actually, once or twice a year, that does teach these divers how to do this sort of survey and documentation and identifying artifacts, and also trilateration, in situ drawings, and so forth. We do that in the water and on land. Initially, we take students on land to give them a general idea of what a shipwreck site would look like, and then we take them in the water to use the technique of trilateration and in situ drawing. Again, trilateration is just a technique of measuring reference points relative to some major reference point like a baseline, and establishing all the artifacts that are scattered across the shipwreck site into what we call a composite map. And this is a composite map that we produce from all of those artifacts and in situ drawings that we produce. And I want to give a big shout out to our profound map maker, Ms. Gail Patrick. She produced this map. This is one of many that we produce on a shipwreck down in the Keys called the Hannah M. Bell. Again, I'm going to keep apologizing for clearing my throat. Hopefully it clears up here as I go along. Another part of our program that one of our colleagues, Mr. Kramer Wimberly, kicked off, the program has grown, it's gotten very strong. As we say in our sort of tagline, we're about restoring our oceans and preserving our heritage. And this is part of the ocean restoration piece here, conservation piece, in terms of the work that we're doing in coral reef restoration. We kicked off a program under Kramer's leadership called CARES. It's an acronym for Collective Approaches to Restoring Our Ecosystem. And we teach young people and adults how to do coral reef surveys and fish surveys, just to do the overall health of the reef, because we understand the criticality of these reefs in terms of our relationship as human beings. Matter of fact, every second breath that you take, more than likely, came from these coral reefs. So they're critically important in terms of maintaining humanity and our very survival. So we think we can do a lot in terms of educating young people and getting them aware of the maritime environment, particularly young folks in the African American community. But we're, again, a very diverse group. Another piece of our program is community outreach. We don't just fly in and do these documentations and then fly out. We like to connect with the community that's particularly related to a particular shipwreck, and help them understand as much as we can the importance of bringing this particular wreck back into memory. We'll talk about that a little bit more with some of the examples I'm going to show later on. So just a few discussion questions, not necessarily for discussion, more rhetorical, I guess. But I thought I would just lay these out to give a sense of the presentation. So can you imagine what it would be like to live without memory of who you are, where you came from, your history, your culture? Excuse me. Would you have a sense of self if you didn't have that sense if you didn't have that particular memory? So memory sort of connects us to our past, our history, right? And those that came before us. So if you are disconnected from those ancestors and memory, how does it affect your identity within the human family? And more importantly, and I really struggle with this one, how it becomes important, or possible rather, for a nation founded on the democratic principles of freedom and justice for all to allow over 250 years of shackled slave and bondage for more than 5 million human beings here in the United States. In the global sense, over 12 to 15 million. So how in shaping the so-called Western civilization that we live under, that a global system of brutal bondage and oppression existed for more than 400 years? I think it's very important for us to find answers to those kind of questions if we're going to really go forward in this human family. So this is an image some of you probably seen before. It's from J.W. Turner's, the British 18th century, late 18th century, 19th century artist. He called it Slave Ship. And this painting adorns the cover of a book that I think is a very important read. And by the way, I have a bibliography to this presentation that I'll put in the chat at the end. And you can access some of the material that I accessed to do this presentation. But the book is called The Slave Ship by Marcus Rediker, The Slave Ship, A Human History. And I took a quote from that book to kind of set the tone for this presentation. And he talked about the importance of the ship, not necessarily the slave ship, but just the ship in general. But his quote said, if you can read it there, the ship was thus central to a profound, interrelated set of economic changes, essential to the rise of capitalism, the seizure of new lands, the expropriation of millions of people, and the redeployment and growing market-oriented sectors of the economy, the mining of gold and silver, the cultivating of tobacco and sugar, and cotton we can throw in there, the concomitant of rising of long-distance commerce, the concomitant rise of long-distance commerce, and finally a planned accumulation of wealth and capital beyond anything the world has ever witnessed. Slowly, fitfully, uneventfully, but with undoubted power, a world market and an international capitalist system emerged, which we all are benefiting from today, I should add. Each phase of the process, from the exploration to the settlement to production to trade and the construction of new economic order, required massive fleets of ships and their capacity to transport both expropriated laborers and the new commodities. And he ends it with, and I place the emphasis there in bold, the Guineaman was a linchpin of the system. And the Guineaman, of course, is the reference to a slave ship during that time period. And of course, linchpin is something that's very vital to the system. So these slave ships is very, very important, and we have to bring them into memory in order to understand that importance. So a little bit more context here about the transoceanic, transatlantic slave trade. There were some 12,000 ships involved in the trade. Of those 12,000 vessels, they made some 40,000 plus voyages over the history of the trade, some 350 years or so. And out of all those voyages, we do have knowledge of about 1,000 plus wrecking events. If you can go to slavevoyages.org, that is a profound database, and I think they say it's about 1,021 or so. So each one of these voyages involves some 12 to 15 million captured human beings. Academics are still discussing this question of how many. Some of them land on the 12.4 million number. I reference you to Phillips Curtin's work, African Slave Trade, a Consensus. He did some good work back in the 60s in trying to come up with a number. And sometimes it goes as high as 25 million. But we do know it was the largest forced movements of human beings in world history. So this global trade, I threw this map up to give you a sense of all the movement from West Africa to the Americas, even as you can see around the south on the lower right side there, some activity in the Indian Ocean as well. And this is a graphics from slate.com that shows the movement of these vessels in the latter part of the 18th century, just about a decade or so. And so you can see the massive number of ships that came across just in those 10 to 12 years or so. And again, this graphic illustrates the last 20, 25 years of the 18th century. The movement of black bodies out of Africa into the Americas that embarked from Africa and disembarked in the Americas, including the Caribbean, peaked at over 2 million individuals over that very short time period. And if you look at over the totality of the 18th century, that is the largest amount of movement of Africans to the Americas and the Caribbean during the whole period. So the 18th century, if you really want to study the trade, you dive right into the 18th century and you'll find some incredible discoveries. So in this case, we're talking about the slave ship. The slave ship possibly as metaphor. What does it mean to you when you hear the term slave ship? It means many things. Of course, it had a dramatic effect on particular people. It had a dramatic effect, of course, on the world. And so this ideal of resistance was always there among these African people that was captured and brought over on these ships during the passage. Particularly, and I'll illustrate some of those a little later on. But there was an interesting phenomenon among these captive Africans, and I want to emphasize also that that these vessels didn't go into West Africa to capture slaves, that they went into West Africa to capture craftsmen, priests, hunters, mothers, fathers. They went into these societies, and the society was totally disrupted, and they was captured to enslave them as they came across the water. But an interesting phenomenon, particularly on the slave ship itself, was that these captured Africans thought it was very noble in a lot of senses to commit suicide, actually, to just jump overboard, as opposed to being exposed to the degradation and humiliation of being enslaved. Matter of fact, some of these vessels had nettings that went all the way around the vessel to prevent these individuals, when they would bring them on deck, from jumping overboard. So when you think about it, and the terror and torture that these individuals went through, you can sort of understand that they can have a more noble sense of what it means to be free by even dying. But there was resilience also for those that survived, and not only resilience, but also creating more memory of what happened to them, and creating a memory of what it was like to be back at home. And later on in this presentation, we're going to use a great example that's been in the news recently around the Clotilda and a community down in Alabama that I've had the pleasure to connect and work with. So in terms of the collective memory, I think it's important, again, that we keep this whole period in memory to have a clear understanding of how we're going forward as a human family, and not forget this incredible period of pain and suffering. We can't, if we don't remember it, we can't get past it. The history is always going to be there. You can't erase the history. So we try to connect with it and tell these stories. And when I say we, in most cases, I'm talking about DWP and the work that we do. Our focus is primarily around telling the stories of these slave ships. So let's look at what we know about these wrecks. As I said, there were some 12,000 vessels involved in the trade. But if you look at the archaeological record, we only have knowledge of about a handful of them that's been documented and even found and located. Matter of fact, the ones that I'm going to present here have not necessarily been documented. We just simply, some of them have just been found. We've found the locations where I shouldn't say that, but found the locations. We know of the locations of where they sunk. One is the Henrietta Marie. I'm the immediate past president of an organization called the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, and NABS, as we call it, was very instrumental in trying to memorialize those captured Africans that was on the Henrietta Marie. The Henrietta Marie sank, as it's shown here, in 1700 on the west of the Keys, and it didn't have any enslaved people aboard. It had just dropped them off in Jamaica, and it got caught up in a storm trying to get back to Europe. And NABS Association put a marker on that site to memorialize those Africans. The Guerrero is what DWP is, how DWP got his fins wet, as a figure of speech. As I mentioned, DWP got its start in 2004, and Brenda Lasendorf was looking for the Guerrero, and just by chance, her and our founder Ken Stewart crossed paths, and Ken put out the call to divers, do they want to dive with a purpose? And so members of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers responded, and the rest is sort of history, so to speak. Well, we're still on the search for the Guerrero. We work with our partners and collaborators in doing this work, with NOAA, the National Park Service, of course the Smithsonian, and others, even globally, that I'll talk about later, in doing this work. And NOAA has worked with Corey Malcolm and at the Mel Fisher Museum, and Corey has done some incredible work and research around the Guerrero. We think that we know where it is, but from our perspective, there's a few more what we call anomalies, locations or possibilities of artifacts related to the wreck that is worth investigating before we can say for sure this is it. We don't have that, quote, smoking gun, if you will. I'm going to be talking about the São José Phuket de Africa a little later in the presentation and do a deep dive on that one. I was involved in some of the work on that particular project, so I won't talk about it much here. The Troubadour, which sank in 1841 around the Turks and Caicos Island. We have a little information on that. The Peter Morel didn't quite sink, more or less, but it did have a pivotal history in slave shipwrecks in terms of being forced to go into the Bahamas and dislodge its captives there. Clotilda as well, I'll be doing a real deep dive on that one. That's the most recent one in 1860s. But, just take note of some of these years of sinking and put it in the context in terms of when the importation of enslaved people were banned in the Americas. 1808 in the U.S., 1807 in Britain, and so forth. The Ouida, again, which was a pirated vessel when it was found, but in 1717 when it sank, but found recently back in 1980s by Barry Clifford up off the New England coast. Queen Anne's Revenge, another pirate vessel. We know it was a former slaver called the La Concorde, found in off the coast of North Carolina, Beaufort's Inlet, recently, and a lot of good work has been done on that one particularly. The General Abercrombie and the Mary, two British vessels. It's got some good indicative data of where those vessels are off of Buck Island, near St. Croix, and the U.S. Park Service footprint down there. The Fredensborg, which is a Danish vessel that crashed off of the coast of Norway when it was trying to make port there in 1768. And also the Christiana's Quintus and the Frederica's Quantus, two vessels that have incredible stories that we think pretty sure there's a lot of circumstantial evidence and artifacts that indicate that these are them, particularly some bricks that was on one of the vessels that we know are Danish bricks. And there's a very large anchor related to these sites as well, off the coast of Costa Rica in the Cahuita National Park down there. Also, the Isle of Lives was a French vessel that crashed off the northern coast of Cuba. And James Matthews, which was, again, a French-Portuguese vessel. That was the name when it crashed. It was repurposed. But archival history shows that it was a former slaver known as the Don Franciscos. So, as I said, there was 12,000 vessels involved in the trade. And right now, in terms of our awareness, what's that, 15? So the question becomes, why have this been left out of our memory? Why don't we know more about these vessels? Why aren't they part of our, not only U.S. history, but world history, since they played such a critical role in who we are and where we are today? So, as part of DWP's effort is to try to bring these vessels back into memory. I'm going to talk about a few of them here, talk a bit about their stories. Some that we were involved in. The first three there you see on the graphic, we were not directly involved in it, but I think their stories are very important. And the last three there, I have been directly involved in the documentation of those three vessels, and we'll do a deep dive on those three. So bringing back into memory the Meermin. As I said earlier, DWP is part of a collaboration, a partnership, if you will, called the shipwrecks Project. The shipwrecks Project is a project under the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C. And we have global partners. And one of those global partners is Eco Museums in South Africa. And the representative of that museum in terms of the maritime archaeologist is Jaco Bischoff. Jaco Bischoff has done some critical work around the Meermin. He's been in search of it for quite a while. Actually, he did his master's thesis on it. Although we haven't quite located it, but he got a good sense of where it is. And I think his initial search developed some good techniques for doing beach searching for wrecked slave ships. But anyway, the Meermin was an East India Company vessel, a three-mast vessel. It set sail on January the 2nd, 1766, with a crew of about 60 men and about 140 captured Africans. What makes this story so incredible, it was sailing from Madagascar, as it says here, to the Cape, and there was a revolt on the vessel. Uh, just real quickly, though, before I go into the revolt, a little bit about the East Indian Company, which is a Dutch company. It could be considered the world's first global conglomerate. They were trading in a lot of commodities, particularly during the 18th century, when a lot of vessels was on the high seas. And as you can see from this graphic, where they was going into all the ports around the globe, not only agricultural commodities, but human beings as well, i.e. slaves that they brought particularly to the South America. So the story of the Meermin, as I said, it was captured Madagascans into South Africa, and they happened to capture one South African named Masavana. He was a leader of his people, and while the vessel was under sail from Madagascar to South Africa, there was a revolt on the vessel. So Masavani took over the vessel, and he commanded the vessel for 2 or 3 days, but recognized very quickly that was a problem. They didn't know how to sail the vessel. Some of the crew was killed, but some of the crew, including the captain, retreated back into the stern, into the captain's quarters, and Masavana began negotiating with them to help them sail the vessel back to Madagascar. The captain agreed, but unfortunately he agreed on the deception and continued to sail to South Africa. The long story short here, they continued to negotiate, and once they reached the shores of South Africa, Masavana said, "This is not South Africa. These are not South African birds. The air doesn't smell Madagascan." So using his intuition, and he knew he was being deceived. And the captain was under desperation. Masavana said he was going to kill them all. He literally put a note in a bottle and threw it out the window. And the folks on shore, a militia had formed because they saw this vessel sailing without a flag. And ultimately, Masavana and his people were captured on the boat after some was killed. Masavana was put on trial and later prosecuted, and he ended up spending the rest of his life in prison. What you're looking at now is from Table Mountain, looking over Cape Town, South Africa, Sea Point in this case, but in the upper right you can see the island there is Robben Island. That's the island that Nelson Mandela spent his 27 years on, and it's believed that Masavana is buried on that island as well. The Zong Massacre, another horrific story around these slave vessels. It was trying to get into port in Jamaica because of the incompetence of the captain, misnavigating. They ended up way out into the Gulf of Mexico. He determined that he didn't have enough water and rations to make port in Jamaica, so he decided to get rid of some of his cargo and try to collect insurance. So he commenced to throwing 133 Africans, men, women, and children, overboard, and tried to collect the insurance once he got into port. And although he failed at that attempt, but never prosecuted. The Lewiston is another incredible story around slave vessels. This is a book written by Leo Bellet called About the Lewiston and the Mutiny and What Happened to It. It's a very good read. It's in the bibliography. You can get your hands on it. But the Lewiston was a Dutch West India Company vessel that set sail in 1737, trying to reach port in Paramaribo, Suriname. But again, because of misnavigation, it sailed up the wrong river. It was looking for the Suriname River and sailed up the Moroni River. And when he realized his mistakes, he reversed course and came out to the mouth of the Moroni River. And when he did, a storm came up. We believe it was a hurricane that eventually sunk the vessel. Now, this vessel was one that was known as, if you know a bit about the Panama Canal, they have these Panamax vessels that goes through, very large vessels taking very large cargo, up to 20,000 tons, or huge vessels. So the Lewiston was basically the Panamax of today. It had about almost 700 Africans on board. And when the storm struck the vessel as it came out into the mouth of the Moroni River, the captain decided to drop anchor to wait out the storm. The storm swung the vessel around, and the stern of the vessel struck the reef and breached, and they started taking on water. Once they started taking on water, What happens next is probably the most horrific tragedies, at least one of the most horrific tragedies that I've read in maritime Atlantic history. The captain gave the order to abandon ship to his crew. And before he told them to leave the ship, he told them to lock down the hatches. They locked the hatches down and abandoned ship and left 700 Africans to fall into the ocean over 2 or 3 days as the ship broke up in the storm. Imagine trying to swim in shackles. Imagine trying to struggle for your very life and breath after sailing 2 or 3 months across the ocean and then dying a horrific death like that. Unimaginable. As I mentioned, the Guerrero is where DWP got his feet wet. It was a Spanish pirate vessel that wrecked in 1827 right near Key Largo. It had 561 Africans aboard, and those 561 Africans had been hijacked by this Spanish pirate, Gomez, and brought aboard the Guerrero. And then once they got to Key Largo, they ran into another British vessel called the Nimble, which was part of the Africa fleet. At the time, you can see this is post the abolishment of importation of slaves. So the British and the U.S. had these naval fleets patrolling the waters, and the Nimble spotted the Guerrero, looked suspicious, and began chasing it. The Guerrero eventually ran aground, and the Nimble followed soon after, right behind it, not at the same location, but right north of it. And in that wrecking event, 41 Africans drowned it. The incredible thing that happened overnight, while they waited for salvors to come rescue them, the pirates hijacked about 350 other Africans again and stole some of the salvors boats and continue on to Cuba, where he was heading initially. The remaining 120 or so Africans was brought into Key West, Florida, and eventually about 91 of those Africans ended up in Liberia. And Gail Swanson, in her book, Slave Ship Guerrero, has identified some of those descendants of this Guerrero saga. That's a very quick story of the Guerrero. If you want to go into deeper, there's a nice video narrated by James Avery that you can, I think it's still available, you can get online. Tell you more about the Guerrero story. And if you're ever down in the Keys, I encourage you to visit Higgs Beach, where there's a nice memorial down there. Actually, the Guerrero is related to this a little bit on Higgs Beach. When those 120 or so Africans were brought into Key West, a few of them died en route, and it's thought that a few of them are buried here on Higgs Beach. But Higgs Beach is the gravesite of about 294 Africans that was brought in on the William Wildfly in the Bogota around 1860. And those were huge vessels. There were almost 1,500 individuals on those vessels collectively. And they were, again, these vessels were brought into port by the Africa fleet that I mentioned earlier. And those Africans that had died on these vessels, again, was buried in these on the Higgs Beach there, and unbeknownst to a lot of folks until recently, when these grave sites was discovered, and they were memorialized with this monument there at Higgs Beach. The São José Paquete Africa. Again, as I mentioned, DWP works with our partners in South Africa. Jaco Bischoff and his team down there has done some incredible work researching this vessel. Jake Hardy, an incredible researcher and diver. Really enjoyed diving with him while I was down there. The São José sunk right off the coast of Cape Town at a beach called Clifton Beach, in about 30 feet of water or so. There's a very rocky environment. The surge is very strong there. But the São José set sail from an island in northern Mozambique called Mozambique Island with mainly Makua people aboard, and was coming around the Cape and was going to pick up provisions before it continued on to Brazil with its Mozambican cargo. But unfortunately, the strong winds from the southwest and the Cape there came up while it was trying to make port and eventually struck the rocks and sank. So the captain was deposed, uh, and he wrote this deposition here, which Jaco Bischoff and our other partners in Mozambique, uh, the Duartes, Ricardo Duarte, and his wife did some incredible research and researching this vessel, found this deposition, and I won't read all of it here. You can see that some of it gave us a sense of where the wreck was located. It was here in Table Bay at the last three lines, and then it says it was right on the Lion's Head. And of course, to the left of this picture is the Lion's Head monument they was referencing. This is the photo you saw earlier, and right below the Lion's Head is Clifton Beach. Another part of that deposition is very, very interesting. He talks about how the wrecking event unfolded and how they tried to save the ship and so forth. And at the very end, the last statement is very interesting. He said the ship became entirely leaked, and that the way of this was Portuguese sort of dialect at the time, so some of the words wasn't translated directly. So it was the people who were in charge of the cargo. They decided to save the slaves and then the people. An important, interesting distinction that they made between who was human and who wasn't. The slaves were maybe not people, but people were, of course, the crew. And another part of this deposition was interesting as well. I just highlighted the red part there. Said they were able to save some of the men and slaves till 5 in the evening when the ship broke up into pieces, and 212 slaves which tried to save themselves died. And it's very interesting how they tried to save themselves in shackles. So they stayed with the wreck and took care of all that washed ashore with the intention to sell everything afterwards in a public selling. And those that did survive this wreck were sold into slavery into the Western Cape. This is some of the archaeological evidence that was discovered around the São José. On the lower left there shows the arrow where it struck the rocks and reefs there. And you can see Clifton Beach there. This wreck was known by some other divers back in 1988. They thought it was a German vessel. But Clifton Beach is a very exclusive area of Cape Town with real high-end condominiums. And so they was enjoying this beach daily, particularly during the apartheid era, not knowing that there was a slave wreck just 300 feet from shore and 30 feet of water. So this ship, we know from this manifest when it left port in Lisbon, Portugal, that it had about 1,500 of these iron ballasts on board. And these ballasts are used to stabilize the ship because the human cargo moves around to provide more stability as it tried to be more efficient in the water. So these ballasts were recovered and conserved down by Jaco and his team. Some other parts of the ship was located. This is a wooden pulley block that was located and preserved, and it's currently on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And there are a number of wooden members and timbers as part of the wreck site as well. We think that the São José had a cargo of timbers on board, but of course it was a wooden vessel as well. And I recall very distinctly when I first dived the site, we do a survey dive on the site. And I came around these huge rocks. The surge, really, for divers that's on tonight, the surge was about 15 to 20 feet, blowing you back and forth. So it was an incredible dive site, very dynamic and turbulent. But I remember coming around these rocks and seeing this wooden member. And I'm first realizing that this was really a part of the São José where those 212 individuals lost their lives. So I just remember pausing just for a moment and touching these wooden vessels. And I don't know if part of you are, but it's a very powerful moment for me because I could feel the horror and the pain and the suffering reverberating in that one wooden member. And This is something that was located on one of my dives. We believe that it was a shackle. It was confirmed that it is a shackle. We was diving in buddy teams at the time for this particular mission. And I was diving with a South African student. Her name is Kanilo Molo Paine. Messing up her last name, but hopefully Kenny forgive me. She's currently a Nat Geo Fellow and also a PhD at at Witwatersrand University. But she was studying for her PhD at the time she was diving with us. She was a human remains anthropologist at the time, and we thought there was a possibility that we might discover some of those. But she's very playful. Kenny is very playful, very beautiful spirit, and so I was operating a dredge head. The environment is very sandy, as you can see on the lower right there slide. And so we had to remove some of the sand out from among the rocks because we know some of the material has settled into the sand. I was dredging, and so Kenny tapped me on the shoulder and tried pulling me, and she was trying to direct me over to an albacore shell that was glistening because it was iridescent in the sunlight. And I said, no, we got to finish work, Kenny. So she insisted. And anyway, long story short, I went over there to take a look, and there were some rocks there, and I started dredging. And this is what was discovered, this shackle from Kenny's playfulness. These are some of the shackles. We think it was a bar shackle that was uncovered. So as I mentioned, the water is very turbulent where São José was wrecked. As I mentioned, the winds coming up from the southwest can create huge breakers over the rocks there. So I was down there. One of my trips, I went down there for about more than 2 weeks, and never was able to dive. So Jaco put us in the lab to clean up some cannonballs. But was doing some conservation work there in his lab. And this is some of the colleagues there that was assisting. Get it going here again. And so this is a map to show where the São José originated, the island of Mozambique. So we went back to that island of Mozambique, and on that island is some structures. One of them is a mosque, and this mosque have these slave tunnels that was under the door. It had trapdoors, and they was basically, we were assuming they were shanghaiing these people and bringing them out through this tunnel to this door, what we call a door of no return. And so Dr. Bunch, this is Dr. Lonnie Bunch, who is the current secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. He was the former director of the National Museum, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He was on this particular trip when we were going to announce the finding of the São José, the only vessel that been found where Africans were aboard when it crashed. So we went to the village elder, Ivano in Hogush. He did this elaborate presentation for us, and he gathered up some sand from his village, and he presented that to Dr. Bunch, and he gave him the instructions to take this soil back to that horrific site where the São José crashed and bring my people back home. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important for any people, but particularly in African cosmology, to be connected with their ancestors. And when you're disconnected from that ancestry, it's like you're wandering around lost, misguided. You got a big hole in your soul that needs to be filled. And you don't have direction because you don't have that ancient wisdom feeding into your memory. So Dr. Bunch, through another ceremony we had in South Africa, gave that soil to me, and with the instructions to deposit it on the beach where deposited on the wreck where the São José went down. You can see to the left there's a rock. It's called Cherry Rock. That's one of the rocks that the São José struck during the wrecking event. And that's us at the lower middle, standing on the beach, deciding whether to dive or whether what to do next. But you can see the surf is very, very strong here. And so we decided that it wasn't diveable and that we was going to wade out into the surf and do this ceremony. And so myself, along with a South African Tana Van Kirk and another indigenous Makua, Yara, in the middle there. We waded out into the surf and did this very powerful emotional memory ceremony to bring these people back into memory. I had good intentions of, of course, you saw in the last picture there, the media from all over the world was there, and good intentions of making this profound statement, but it was so powerful I couldn't say anything. So we just carried out the ritual to bring these people back to their people. So we went back to the Makua village and told the elder that we have carried out his mission and reconnected him back to his ancestors. And so when we did that, he made some opening comments, and then he paused for a very profound moment. And he made a statement, something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, now that you all have carried out this mission, that the rains that's falling on our village is like the tears of our ancestors refertilizing our soil. So it was a very powerful experience for me. These are some of the individuals that some of the principal investigators, particularly, that was involved in the São José project. And the light blue shirt there is Yako. I've mentioned his name a number of times, with Dr. Bunch. And then the young lady, the lady in the middle there, she's the director of the Ezekiel Museum in South Africa, and Paul Gardulo is affiliated with the National Museum of African American History here in Washington, D.C. On extreme right is Dr. Stephen Lepkeman, who is George Washington University and a co-director with Paul of the Shipwrecks Project, announcing the finding of the São José. So we'll quickly, time is sort of getting of the essence. I'll talk about the Clotilda story, which is an incredible story within itself. It's been in the news here recently. The Clotilda story started basically with a bet. There was extreme tensions between the North and the South around 1860. And so Timothy Mayer on the left here made a bet that he can snub his nose up at the Northerners and go into Africa and bring some captured Africans into the United States in 1860, just a few months before the start of the Civil War. And he hired the captain in the middle there, William Foster, to assist. So he built this ship called the Clotilda, and this is just a documentation of the bet. And he made the journey. He departed on March 4th, 1860, went into what's present-day Benin, or Ouida, and came back in July 9th and brought these about 110 Africans up into Mobile Bay, up the Columbia River. And this is part of his statement that he made, that he brought them up into the river, and he transferred them to another riverboat that took them into a cane break, like a swampy reed cane sort of area on the Mobile River there. And he hid them until they can expose them to the buyers. And then, dastardly, he took the Clotilda further upstream and tried to burn it and destroy the evidence, because the federal authorities supposedly was coming down on him. It was punishable by death if you broke that 1808 law of importing Africans into the U.S. One of those Africans on that boat was Kazula. That's an incredible story here. I encourage you to learn more about this. Again, there's a lot in the press now because of the work around the National Geographics and some other documentaries that have come out. He was thought to be the oldest survivor of the Clotilda. He transitioned, passed in 1935, and his story was documented by this ethnographer, anthropologist Zora Hurston back in the 1920s, a few years before he transitioned. And I encourage you to get this book and just read the words of Kazula in his own word and in his own dialect. It tells a very powerful story. But since that time, there's a scholar in England by the name of Hannah Durkin. She did some more work and found that in 1938, Ridoshi, she lived a few years longer than Kazula, and she did some more research and found that Matilda McQueer died in 1940, who was also as a child. I think she was about 3 or 4 years old on the Clotilda when it came over, but she died in 1940. And her story in itself is incredible. Matter of fact, in 1970, she made an appeal to the county in Alabama for reparations for the time that she was kept in bondage. And of course, they wasn't having it. So finding the Clotilda was sort of a very interesting process. Back in 2018, in January, a reporter down there by the name of Ben Raines thought he had discovered the remains of the Clotilda, and it got the community very excited. And we were called in to investigate, and ultimately it ended up not being the Clotilda. And the descendants, talking to them down there, they called it the No-Tilda. It was kind of funny, but anyway, we went down there to investigate it. These are one of the shots from Alabama.com story that was published. That's me doing some of the documentation on the wreck. They called in Search, which is one of the premier maritime archaeology firms in the country, to determine whether this was the Clotilda or not. And we basically determined that it wasn't. So the Alabama Historical Commission said, well, we need to really find the Clotilda. And so they hired Search to do a more detailed analysis of the wrecks along the Alabama River here. And this is part of that Search team. This is myself on the left, and the second from the left is Dr. Jim Delgado, probably the premier maritime archaeologist in the country. He probably don't like me saying that. And that's part of it. There's other two maritime archaeologists as part of Search, Kyle Lent and Joe Gernon, as part of the Search team. So we spent days surveying this river, going up and down, getting anomalies, and we found one that was of particular interest, as you can see here with the buoy marker. And it was very near a property line marker of the Meers. The Meer family is a very powerful family in Alabama. They carry on a lot of political sway down there. And so these are some of the sonar images that we picked up. I'll just move along real quickly here. This labels some of the images here. You can see this is the Clotilda is probably the most important find in terms of shipwrecks, slave shipwrecks particularly, because about 70 to 80% of the vessel is still intact. And we can see exactly where the hole where these 110 so captives was held in the voyage coming across the passage. You can see the bulkhead there up front toward the bow, and the bulkhead going back toward the stern. That's about a 500 square foot area, about 23 feet by 24 feet or so. 112 people crammed in that space. The ship was burnt, as I mentioned earlier, by the captain, William Foster. Some of the artifacts that that was discovered here. This is called a centerboard trunk, one of the walls for the trunk. And just real quickly, you can see in the middle lower right there, that's called a centerboard. When the vessel is underway and on the high seas, it provides some stability. And when it comes up into say a shallow waters like a river, the board is basically raised up into this trunk. And that's what we saw here as part of that trunk. This is some of the other artifacts, the copper sheeting. We know the Clotilda had copper sheeting, and some of the tack marks there, some of the wood samples, the type of wood that was used to build it. And so we sort of put two and two together, start matching up what we were finding, artifacts that we know, and information that we knew about the Clotilda specifications. On the left side there, we knew it was about, the survey showed it was about 85 to 90 feet, 80 feet long, and so forth and so on. The tonnage, the type of wood lined up after we did the wood analysis, and some of the other materials, and some of the burnt charred wood was found as well. And it was sunk in 20 feet of water from the wreck, and that's where we found it. That's where it was located, I should add. So there's a descendant community there from the Clotilda, who after the Civil War, they tried to petition the Meers to give them land. They said no, and so under the leadership of Kazula, I showed you earlier, and Peter Lee and others, they bought the land, purchased some land, and started a community down there called Africa Town. This is a chimney from the homestead of Peter Lee, Grandpa Peter Lee. They established a church down there. You can see on this list, Kazula was one of the founders of a church down there, the Union Baptist Church is still in existence today. But these people have suffered over the last 160 years some of the most horrific, in my perspective anyway, um, type of racism, from environmental racism, industrial pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But they have been very resilient, and survive to this very day. Um, this is a shot of the church. You can see they have a monument in front of it in honor, a memorial in honor of Kazula. And right across the street from the church is the graveyard. There's the church in the background on the left center. Right across the street is the graveyard. And this community was dissected back in the 90s by a state highway. And now you got these big trucks and things, and it's coming through the community. Huge disruption and cause economic decay as well. But in the cemetery is the very old members of this community, this descendant community, that can trace their ancestry back all the way back to those individuals that was on this vessel and in Benin. This is the wife of Osa Kibi, one of the founders of the church, and the original member of the Clotilda victims. And this is a marker for Kazula. Don't know exactly where his grave is, but this marker was erected in his honor. And this is one of the leaders in the descendant community, Joycelyn Davis. She and other members of the community established the Clotilda Descendants Association. They had a celebration just this past weekend. I think the fourth of many, hopefully going forward, and telling the story of the descendants of that community. As I mentioned earlier, we do community engagement work, and we engage in this community to help tell the story, not tell them how to tell the story, but again, to provide information and insight to let them tell the story as they see fit. And they was extremely happy. Discovering the Clotilda was a turning point. It's an important artifact as part of the story, but the most important piece of the story are those faces you're seeing now, the people and the descendants of the community. There's a couple of books that's been written on the story that's in the bibliography. Ben Raines has just published a book as well. So from DWP's perspective, and I'll wrap it up here, we're continuing our search for these vessels. The one that we're interested in is called the Wanderer. It was the penultimate vessel that brought Africans into the U.S. illegally in 1859 and brought them into Jekyll Island. We know where it wrecked off the eastern coast of Cuba after it was repurposed after the Civil War. We're still doing work in Mozambique. There's a vessel called Aurora that has an incredible story, and there's a rebellion related to that story as well. I talked about the Lewiston, and also we're very interested in some that hadn't been directly related to slave trade, but is very much part of the African American story. It's a shipwreck of the Black Star Line, or Marcus Garvey shipwreck, the very first African American ownership of a ship line. We know where some of those wrecks sites are as well, and hopefully we'll find them as well. And to wrap up here, just real quickly, I invite you to check out the March edition of the National Geographic. We've got a front page story done by Tara Roberts, incredible individual that just from a single photo has come from that single photo of the work of DWP to being on the cover of the National Geographic magazine. So I encourage you to do that. Even go to the site. You can see the story now on their site. She has a podcast. I think we just finished the third podcast in a 7-podcast series talking about Into the Depths and the work of Diving with a Purpose and her search for working with us in the search for these shipwrecks. This documentary is on YouTube. That talks a bit about our work as well. It's part of National Geographic developed this as well. And I mentioned this one that was recently put together by a filmmaker from Mobile, Alabama, Margaret Brown, called Descendant, that won the award at the Sundance and has been picked up by Netflix and the Obamas, and hopefully we'll get a summer release of that. There's museum exhibits. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, get by the African American Museum. You can see an exhibit on the DWP and some of the work that we've done, and exhibit of the São José. And I'll sort of leave it there, Liz. If folks want to contact us, you can go to our website. And I encourage you, if you go to the website, if you like the work that we've done in terms of not only telling the stories of these slave vessels, but empowering young people to tell these stories as well, and get them involved in maritime sciences and so forth, click the donate button and help us out a bit. And if you want to contact me, you can just reach me at kamau.sadiki@divingwithapurpose.org. So I just encourage folks to 12 million individuals was impacted or more from this, using this technological artifact called a slave ship. And a lot of more work needs to be done to bring them back in their memory. I hope you all can join us in that work. DWP will be starting another training session here in June. Again, if you go to the website, you can get more information about that. If you're interested in joining us and doing this work, you can come join us in class and start the journey. So I really appreciate your time and attention. And hopefully, Liz, we can have some questions. And I'll unshare my screen.
Thank you so much. You presented us with a wealth of information and knowledge, and the historical aspects that you and Diving with a Purpose do it's so important, and transferring that information that you collect and that you get in these documentaries and the books and doing presentations like this. So thank you for your time. Thank you for all the work that you do, and we greatly appreciate you being with us tonight. And we also appreciate our sponsors, Culture Builds Florida and the Drace family. And as a thank you from the museum, we give you a 1-year membership. So you can come down here 362 days or the 5 days that you're down in the Keys, and bring your group and have them see the exhibits. We still have the replica of the Henrietta Marie Bell in our in our treasure room with our submerged cultural resources, and continue to tell that story. So I know that Linnea is filtering some questions, but we wanted to take a minute to thank you for your presentation and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Lisa. And I also dropped the bibliography in the chat for folks that want to pull it down.
Great. And I think Linnea also added the Diving with a Purpose website and information on your programs. So thank you, Linnea.
I also added a link to that Nat Geo article that he was talking about. It's a very cool 6-part series you should all just click and check out. And your presentation was very thorough. So a lot of the questions we got from Facebook and Instagram, you naturally answered. But there was one question by a user called Jen that I thought was very interesting, and I'd love to hear your answer. Jen wanted to know, of the many meaningful artifacts and historic items you've found while scuba diving, and she wrote this while you were talking about your time in South Africa. She's curious, have you seen any of these items after their preservation on display in a cultural site?
Yes. Thanks, Jen, for that question. As I mentioned, some of these artifacts are still being conserved. It takes a bit of time to conserve some of these artifacts. So if I understand the question correctly, there is an exhibit, a current exhibit at the National Museum of African American History that is displaying some of these artifacts. There's ballast there, the shackles are there, and pieces of the wood material is preserved there as well. The pulley sail that I showed is on display there as well. And I think they're going to be there for probably the next 5 more years, I believe. There was a 10-year agreement. And then they go back to South Africa and be on exhibit in South Africa as well. Concerning the Clotilda artifacts, that's still trying to be determined how all that process is going to play out. The priority right now is to conserve and preserve and stabilize the shipwreck site. And there has been some extraction of some artifacts from that site. That's somewhat of a museum, but a African heritage house is being constructed in Africa Town, and some items will be on display there as they are conserved appropriately.
So the second part of her question was actually, what was the experience like for you personally when you saw some of those artifacts?
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I missed that. I apologize.
Oh, I didn't say it. I buried the lead.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, you know, in DWP, we treat these sites as very sacred sites. We know people have lost their lives. It's not just we're there to gather the signs, to do the archaeology and so forth, but we know that these are very powerful sacred sites. And for me, it always touches me. I don't know, because of my own personal sensitivities and connection, ancestral connectivity here, but it was profoundly moving and emotional. You run the range of emotions. And I remember, being in an ocean full of water and crying with my mask on when I discovered that shackle. And so um, it's hard to process all those different sort of emotions, but you find a way to do it because you have to tell the stories of these silent voices. So again, it was very emotional.
I'm sure. Thank you for that answer and for this presentation, for giving these people voices.
Sure.
We have another question that someone just entered into the chat. And for people still on, if you have questions, feel free to type them out in the chat and I'll read them out for you. So Nick is asking, has anyone made photogrammetry models of any of the wrecks you've worked on?
Yes. I think if you on the Guerrero particularly, Corey Malcolm has done some good work on the Guerrero and doing 3D models of artifacts that they worked on, and that's probably of the ones that I've worked on. Well, most of the photogrammetry type and 3D imaging work has been done. You can reference that online if you just do photogrammetry work or search using the search tags of photogrammetry Guerrero. I'm sure it'll take you right to the work that Corey has done. He's posted all of it up online for the public to have access to.
All right. Oh, all right. We have another question. Is there any chance of finding remains on these dives? And if so, how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, there's always that possibility. As I mentioned on the initial work we was doing on the São José, we had Kenny on board, who was a human remains anthropologist. And if we do find something, we have to stop immediately and uh, and pay those individuals their proper honor and respect. And after we go through that process of doing that, and if recovery is part of that process, or just leave them in situ where they lie, we have to find another strategy how to work around that. But yeah, that's always a possibility. Fortunately, in doing this work, I haven't had that. The strongest possibility was on the São José because we knew that a lot of the wreckage material was buried under, foots of sand. As we was dredging, we could have potentially ran across some human remains, but fortunately, out of the 4 or 5 sites that I've worked, I haven't had that experience yet.
Okay, that's the end of our questions, but thank you again for your answers.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the questions.
And I do want to remind people that if you're watching this recorded after this evening's live presentation on YouTube, that you can put questions in the comments below, and we check that, and we'll get back to Kamau, and we'll get back to you with a reply. So thank you for those who are engaging tonight, as well as those who will see it later on.
And that's also a good reminder. There's quite a few people that came late to the presentation. I highly recommend if you go on Friday on YouTube, this video will be posted there.
All right. Well, thank everybody for being with us tonight. Again, thank you, Kamau, for joining us. And we hope to see everybody next month in March. Our presentation is going to be on sea monsters and medieval Renaissance maps. It coincides with our fantasy exhibit, the Dive into Art, and our presenter will be Chet Van Duzer. So hopefully we'll see you in March, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. And as we kind of absorb the information that we got tonight, and the stories continue.
And thank you, Lisa, for all the good work you're all doing. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.